I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 83 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Health. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. In accordance with our routine motion, I'm informing the committee that all remote participants have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting, so we have Mr. Davies and Ms. May participating remotely. Today, pursuant to an order of reference on Wednesday, February 8th, 2023, the committee is resuming its consideration of Bill C-293, an act respecting pandemic prevention and preparedness. Today, we are going to begin clause-by-clause consideration of this bill. As you will have been informed by email, we have resources right up until question period if needed. So we will proceed, I guess, until there is a motion for adjournment or we get to the end of the agenda, or 150 probably to allow people to get to question period. So we'll just see how it goes. I just want you to know that the ability to extend is there for us. I would like to welcome the officials from the Public Health Agency of Canada who are here to answer any substantive questions you have as we go through the amendments. So we have Stephen Bent, the Vice President of the Strategic Policy Branch, Dr. Donald Shepard, Vice President, Infectious Diseases and Vaccination Programs Branch, and David Creasy, Director General, Strategic Policy Branch. So they are there as a resource to us. And we also have some folks from Legislative Council on any technical questions, technical, legal, procedural questions with regards to the amendment. So we are very well supportive, and hopefully that will contribute to our efficiency today. I'd like to provide you with some instructions and a few comments on how we're going to proceed with clause-by-clause consideration of C-293. As the name indicates, this is an examination of all the clauses in the order in which they appear in the bill. I'll call each clause successively, and each clause is subject to a debate and a vote. If there are amendments to the clause in question, I will recognize the member proposing it, who may explain it, but shouldn't feel compelled to launch into a lengthy explanation because of the sheer volume. The amendment will then be open for debate. When no further members wish to intervene, the amendment will be voted on. Amendments will be considered in the order in which they appear in the bill or in the package each member received from the clerk. Members should note that amendments must be submitted in writing to the clerk of the committee, and the ones that were provided in writing to the clerk of the committee to date are reflected in your package. We'll go as slowly as we need to allow for all members to follow the proceedings properly. Amendments have been given a number in the top right corner to indicate which party submitted them. There's no need for a seconder to move an amendment. Once it's moved, you'll need unanimous consent to withdraw it. During debate on an amendment, members are permitted to move sub-amendments. These sub-amendments must also be submitted in writing. They don't require the approval of the mover of the amendment. Only one sub-amendment may be considered at a time, and that sub-amendment cannot be further amended. When a sub-amendment is moved to an amendment, it is voted on first. Then another sub-amendment may be moved, or the subcommittee may consider the main amendment and vote on it, which is all a procedure which you are familiar with in the general moving of motions in this committee.
Order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to, this is an important conversation that we're having, and we need to get through this study, obviously. But I'd like to resume the debate on my opioids motion from last week, and I move that we resume that debate on the opioids motion from last week, Mr. Chair. And to my colleagues, there was an article over the weekend that really brings home the problem that I want to...
A motion to resume debate is not debatable. So now that you've moved the motion, we must proceed directly to a vote. And then you're free to
Where,
make
Miss-
further
okay.
representations. But once you make a motion
Okay.
to resume debate, we have to proceed directly to a vote.
But-
So this is a non-debatable motion, and the motion is that debate be resumed on the motion of Mr. Doherty, which was adjourned on Wednesday. Yep. Mr. Doherty, I have made my first of probably several mistakes today. A motion cannot be moved on a point of order.
Mr. Chair.
Once we start the meeting and you get the floor, without raising a point of order, you're welcome to move your motion again, and we'll follow that process. Now, on your point of order.
But, Mr. Chair, I went into a lengthy conversation with our team in good faith last week. At a time when I was talking about and sharing my personal story with this committee, but also challenging us as a committee to do, if people didn't believe me, they should believe the 17 leading addictions physicians that wrote this letter. When I was doing my intervention, I had colleagues that were openly mocking what I was doing. And I just, it's frustrating for me, Mr. Chair. There was an article that really, over the weekend, that really brings this home. The so-called safe
Point of
supply
order, Mr.
is really
Chair.
anything but.
A point of order for Mr. Davies.
Mr. Doherty is not stating a point of order. He's engaging in debate. And by the way, for the record, there was absolutely zero mocking by anybody of anybody.
I
last
disagree.
meeting.
No.
But I'd please ask him, he has no point of order. He's just simply trying to reopen debate on the motion. Please ask him to state his point of order so you can deal with the point of order, and then we can move to the vote.
I think it's a fair point, Mr. Doherty. I know that you want to resume debate. The right time to do that is not on a point of order. And if there is a point of order, please get to it. But so far, I'm inclined to, based on what I've heard so far, I'm inclined to agree with Mr. Davies that you're utilizing a point of order in order to re-enter a debate. And so if that is in fact what your intention is, then please let's terminate it and do it the right way. If you actually have a point of order, I'm interested to hear it.
I'll cede the floor.
Dr. Ellis, do you have a point of order?
No, I do have a motion, though, Mr. Chair.
Okay, well, can I at least finish my opening statement, and then we will open the floor, and that would be an appropriate time for motions and the like.
Mr. Chair, just to say, on your initial discussion of procedure, I had my hand up to add something to that in relation to procedure, because I think it's the only moment where it will fit. But I'll wait a chance if you have to give me the floor.
Thank you. All right. We were talking about sub-amendments. Once every clause has been voted upon, the committee will vote on the title and the bill itself in order to reprint the bill. In order to reprint the bill, an order to reprint the bill may be required if amendments are adopted, so that the House has a proper copy for use at report stage. Finally, the committee will have to order the chair to report the bill to the House. That report contains only the text of any adopted amendments as well as an indication of any deleted clauses. All right, so that's it by way of preliminaries. And now pursuant to Standing Order 75, Sub 1, consideration of Clause 1, the short title and of the preamble are postponed. The chair calls Clause 2. I see Ms. May, Dr. Ellis, and Mr. Doherty. Ms. May first, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My comments are entirely procedural because as you went through the process that we will be undertaking, I want to reacquaint members of the committee with the motion this committee passed, and it's under some degree of, I will admit, duress. that this process applies to me and only to members of parties that have fewer than 12 MPs in the House. Every committee has passed identical motions and has done so in every year since. I think Stephen Harper came up with this in PMO in 2014, and subsequently, after every election, every committee, once it dies, when it restarts, passes a motion that subtracts from the rights I ordinarily would have to present amendments on bills at report stage. I only mention this because when you say that motions will come forward after they are moved, I am not, under the terms of your motion, allowed to move my own amendments. My amendments will be deemed moved. I do have a right at that moment to speak to them, but not at length. I do find this whole process oppressive and discriminatory, but I do follow the rules, and I wanted to make sure that members of committee wouldn't be surprised when my motion is, without me being able to move it, deemed moved, and we proceed in every other fat way. Well, not in every other way. In some ways, as if it was
Point of order, Chair.
Or conservative motion.
Is Dr. Ellis?
Point of order. You know, I guess I feel like strongly about this, Chair. You know, this member saying that the rules set out by the House of Commons are oppressive and discriminatory. I would suggest that those, excuse me, I believe I have the floor, Chair.
Go ahead, Dr. Ellis, on your point
I
of
would
order.
suggest to you that the rules and regulations and policies that we follow here in the House of Commons are not oppressive or discriminatory. I would suggest very clearly that they are based on the fact that those who get to sit around this table on a regular basis are folks who, by the voters of Canada, have achieved the greatest results and are proportionally represented here. So to suggest that the voters of Canada are oppressive and discriminatory is an absolutely ludicrous and untenable position. And I guess to further that position is to say that the member wishes to continue to create a diatribe against Canadians when here what we're doing is to say that, excuse me, Chair, I guess, again, I find that oppressive and discriminatory that the member wishes to sit there and mock and laugh what I am attempting to say here. And I don't think this is absolutely funny at all. And to have someone who wishes to interrupt and join our committee and continue to attempt to interrupt me and laugh and think that this is all very hilarious, that they want to bring a point forward that is oppressive and discriminatory, is really getting to the core of being of a Westminster style of government. And for someone to absolutely suggest that the voters of Canada who have elected 338 members of parliament around this country, across this country, up and down this country, is to me an affront to the entire system that we have. And again, as I said, Mr. Chair, for that individual to take umbrage with that and also to find the hilarity therein is a significant problem for me. Also to use language that is, in my mind, offensive to me as a person and as a first-time elected member here for merely 2 years, and to have a senior elected member from the opposite side of the country
Point of order,
who
Mr. Chair.
perhaps would wish to...
Point of order, Dr. Hanley.
Point of order, a point of order?
Point of order on the substance that this current speech by Mr. Ellis is not a point of order.
I'm inclined to agree with you. Dr. Ellis, if you can wrap it up, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I will wrap it up. I guess there were several things that I believe that saying that the system of government that we have is oppressive and discriminatory. I think it's very, very clear that that is not the style of government that we have. And for a senior elected member to suggest that this system is oppressive and discriminatory would be an affront to the system which we have. I think that we should be setting examples for folks such as myself who have been here a mere 2 years, as opposed to laughing and finding jocularity and humor. And actually taking affront with our system in essence. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you, Ms. May, because you had the floor. Please resist the urge to prolong this debate. The procedural points that you made were ones of which I was aware, but you were right to point out to the committee to make them aware as well. But if again, if you could, we'd like to get on with business, and I know you would too. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do apologize. I did not know that Dr. Ellis could hear any of my reaction to his speech because I thought I was back on mute. I just want to clarify again that this is not, my comments about oppressive and discriminatory do not relate to the rules of the House of Commons. Under the rules of the House of Commons, under the standing orders, I would have the right to present these amendments at report stage in front of the House of Commons as a whole. It's because of the motion passed by this committee with identical wording passed by every other committee that I am simultaneously presenting amendments this morning to your committee. I am also on trying to present amendments simultaneously, amendments to Bill C-20 before the Security Committee. Only a person in my position could possibly be required under motions passed by committees to show up in two places at the same time. And even on Zoom, it's not possible. So my priority is here for this bill. I may have to exit to try to get into the Security Committee under Chair McKinnon to present amendments. I appreciate the deference that I'm senior. I do feel more senior space than others. And I apologize and will end there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. May. Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Chair, there was an article, I'll start over again. There's an article over the weekend that really brings home the problem that I started talking about last week. The so-called safe supply is really anything but. There seems to be a desire on the other side of the table to avoid talking about this. We've pushed to study the opioids issue for some time. Obviously, I'm new to this committee, or new back to, or just recently back to this committee. But I have been part of a number of debates, and I look to the end of the table where our colleague, Mr. Davies, is normally there, and I see him online. You can say a lot of things about the partisan politics in the House of Commons over the 8 years that I've been elected, 8 years just last Friday. But the one thing that we seem to come together on is mental health and addictions. We always seem to be able to be on the same page of that. We've been pushing the government for 8 years to declare the opioid crisis a national health crisis. With the exception of, I would say, in the last 20 months, where our colleagues from the NDP seem to be siding when it
Mr. Chair,
push comes to shove.
Point of order from Mr. Davies. Go ahead.
The current speaker is completely irrelevant to the subject under discussion. We are currently in business before the committee, which is to do a clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-293, which is a bill, an act suspending pandemic prevention and preparedness, and he's speaking about the opioid crisis. Erroneously.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Davies. Apparently, Mr. Majumdar has a point of personal privilege.
I would like to contend that Mr. Doherty is not irrelevant, which is exactly what the honourable member had said. He said that the speaker is irrelevant, and I think that was abusive language.
If I could continue
Mr. Davies, yes, go ahead, please. What I heard him say was that the point raised by him was completely irrelevant, which is a valid point of order. Go ahead, Mr. Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, anybody listening with a modicum of good faith would understand what I was saying, which was that the speaker, the points that he is making, important as they may be, are irrelevant. And one of the rules of speaking is that one must be, the comments must be germane to the matter under at hand. We don't have any motion before us. Mr. Doherty hasn't even moved a motion, and yet he's speaking to a completely different subject than the one under consideration. I might add that, as he well knows, this committee has already agreed to study the opioid overdose crisis as early as in December. So why he's raising this now is beyond me. We do have an act that we have to get through a bill that we have to get through by Friday, or it will be reported back to the House unamended. So I would just ask you, Mr. Chair, to hold the speakers to the basic requirement of relevancy to the topic at hand. If Mr. Doherty wants to make a motion to start talking about a completely different subject than we have before us at committee, then he can make that motion and we can vote on it. Mr. Ellis gave a very impassioned and eloquent defense of democracy. That would be the democratic route, to find out if the majority of committee members here today would rather deal with the bill before us or talk about the overdose crisis when we intend on beginning a study on that very subject in as little as 6 weeks.
Okay, Mr. Davies makes it is a valid point of order with respect to the relevance of Mr. Doherty's presentation to the matter before the committee. What has been called is Clause 2. And he also makes a valid point that if Mr. Doherty wishes to present a motion to resume debate, that's in order, but a lengthy discussion on something other than Clause 2 isn't. There is a fair degree of latitude that rests with the chair with respect to relevance and repetition. All I would say to Mr. Doherty is it is a valid point. If you wish to move a motion to resume debate, that would be in order. But a lengthy discussion of something other than Clause 2 isn't. So you have the floor, sir.
Mr. Chair, I appreciate the interventions by our colleagues and by yourself, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to explain myself. It is relevant to the study at hand today, because we've seen throughout the pandemic that the mental health crisis, the addictions crisis, has become even more critical, Mr. Chair. I would like to move that we resume debate on the opioid motion from last week. And Mr. Chair, to that, I would like to say that, again, my motion from last week called for an end to the program funding. I don't believe any of our colleagues around this table, and if I would have been able to continue along the path of where I was going before I was interrupted by Mr. Davies, as I said, as I was about to say, is we've always had a...
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Davies, on a point of order.
I would ask the honourable member to retract his comment. I did not interrupt him. I raised a point of order. I would ask for him to retract that statement and apologize.
Well, Mr. Chair, I was my intervention was interrupted by a point of order by Mr. Davies. Mr. Chair, as I was going down the path of saying, we've always been on the same page with our colleagues from the NDP up to recently regarding the opioid issue and pushing for this government to do more.
Mr. Doherty, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have presented a motion that isn't debatable, and now you're on to debate. So if you wish the committee to consider the motion, we need to go directly to a vote now.
I have an opportunity to explain my motion as to why I think we need to
No, actually you don't. As soon as the motion is moved, it needs to be voted on. Any comments after the motion constitute debate. So we have a motion before the committee to resume debate on the motion. All those in favor of resuming debate, please raise your hand. All those opposed to the motion, please raise your hand. The motion is defeated. We are now back to Clause 2. I recognize Dr. Ellis.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would suggest that owing to the escalating opioid epidemic having had a devastating impact on the health of Canadians, especially during the pandemic, that the committee need to conduct upcoming studies with respect to the opioid epidemic in conjunction at the same time as the women's health study. And Mr. Chair, why is this important? It's important because Canadians out there are dying.
Point of order, Mr. Davies.
We are not in committee business. I'm not sure that there has been we've been given 48 hours notice of this motion. We have, I'm mistaken, but I don't believe we have. This subject that's being raised by Dr. Ellis is out of order.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Davies. There are two circumstances under which the motion can be considered. One or three circumstances. One if it's moved in committee business. A second, if it is relevant to the subject matter of this study, and the third is if there has been 48 hours notice given. I find that none of those conditions exist, and that the motion is therefore out of order. Dr. Ellis.
Mr. Chair, I would certainly like to challenge the chair on that. We know that very clearly during the pandemic, the opioid epidemic became significantly worse. That is not to say that it wasn't bad before that, but we know that it became significantly worse. And we know that that is very much germanely associated to what we wish to discuss today, the pandemic preparedness, which would include things such as understanding how to look after folks who struggle with things like addiction and homelessness and other health issues, access to the healthcare system. I would suggest that what we need to understand very clearly
Dr. Ellis,
is
I'm sorry to cut you off again, but I'm going to be consistent. You have moved a non-debatable motion, and you're now engaging in debate on a non-debatable motion. We're obliged to go directly to the vote. And the motion, the question for the committee is whether the ruling of the chair shall be sustained. So the chair ruled that a motion with respect to an opioid study is out of order. The question for you is whether the ruling of the chair shall be sustained.
Point of order, Chair. It's
Yes.
directly related to the pandemic, the opioid crisis as it relates directly to the pandemic, which I believe is part of the part of the bill that we talk about here, which, if I might say,
Dr. Ellis,
an act representing pandemic prevention and preparedness.
It's a fair point. Just for the clarity of the committee before we proceed to a vote, I'd invite Dr. Ellis to again read the motion that I have ruled out of order. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. That owing to the escalating opioid epidemic having had a devastating impact on the health of Canadians, especially during the pandemic, the committee conducted its upcoming studies on women's health concurrently with its study on the opioid crisis.
So for clarity, colleagues, I've ruled that motion to be out of order, and the ruling has been challenged. The question for the committee is, shall the ruling of the chair be sustained? All those in favor of sustaining the ruling of the chair, please raise your hand. All those opposed, the motion is defeated. The ruling of the chair is sustained. We are now back to Clause 2. On Clause 2, the first amendment is CPC 1. Is there someone that wishes to move CPC 1? Dr. Ellis, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And sorry, I just have to turn a few pages here to get to where we are. When we look at this bill in its essence, part of the idea around this bill is talking about prevention of a pandemic and future pandemics. Most of these pandemics, of course, are international in origin, and to suggest that we could have a bill here in Canada that could prevent everything that happens around the world, in my mind, is a bit overly ambitious. I guess the other difficulty that I would have with this is my understanding that the individual who has presented this bill really hasn't been very actively engaged in promoting it or trying to make it something useful. And when we look at the goal of a government to, in future public health emergency is to reduce the spread, to mitigate damage, and protect the public, that to suggest that a bill that we have here would be able to prevent a global catastrophe, much of what we have seen here in the last 3 years, as I said, is perhaps aspirational in nature, but very much overly ambitious and unrealistic in its scope. Therefore, and also I would suggest that the other parts of this bill are very jurisdictional in nature, and with their inability to influence provincial governments really is kind of nonsensical. That being said, you know, a bill that would suggest that the government of Canada can control the actions of the entire world really seems nonsensical to me, and therefore continuing down the road of having discussions when we have other significant and perhaps more significant things to discuss, when the Liberal government has chosen not to have a pandemic inquiry, and it would appear by this bill that the Liberal government doesn't wish to have a pandemic inquiry, that they would be satisfied having a private member's bill suffice for all Canadians to be the inquiry with respect to a pandemic. And from my perspective, when we look at this, Chair, it would seem something that is incredibly short in its ability to provide what Canadians are looking for. The pandemic realistically took a significant toll on Canadians with their ability to provide for themselves, with their ability to access medical care, with their ability to continue their businesses. And of course, since the time of the pandemic, what have we seen? We have seen 40-year highs of inflation, Mr. Chair. We have seen escalating interest rates at the hands of this Liberal government because of the money that they printed. And part of the original issue when we came to this bill, witnesses presented by the Conservative Party were also those who would have spoken on behalf of Canadians in terms of the cost of living crisis that the printing of money has since caused. They would have also talked about the banking system. They would have also spoke very clearly about the mental health effects that happened to children, that perhaps there were more issues related to mask wearing than not, and are these things going to be an essential part of moving forward? We also would have called witnesses related to the issues around. What
Yes,
is up with this
Mr.
guy
Davies
today?
on a point of order.
Thank you. Maybe Dr. Ellis could turn off his mic before he makes snide comments. My point of order is the issue that we're debating is the purpose of the Act, which says the purpose of this Act is to prevent the risk of and prepare for future pandemics and to promote transparency and accountability, etc. And the Conservative motion, which is moved ironically by the Conservatives and by Dr. Ellis, is simply to change the words to prevent the risk of, to reduce as much as possible the risk of. As you said at the beginning of this, Mr. Chair, in moving a motion to amend the bill, we are to speak briefly to the amendment. And what Dr. Ellis is doing is meandering onto all sorts of completely unrelated subjects, including the economy, when the only purpose of his own amendment is to change the words prevent the risk of to reduce as much as possible the risk of. So I would just ask that if he wanted to talk about these other subjects, it was entirely open to him to amend the purpose of the Act, to talk about the economy and all sorts of other things. He did not do that. So I would call on him as my point of order to have him speak to his amendment and to restrict his comments to the reasoning for his amendment and any related facts to that instead of a meandering subject of the pandemic in general.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. Point of order with respect to relevance and repetition is a valid point of order. As I said before, there's a pretty wide latitude in the chair with respect to relevance. Dr. Ellis is clearly testing the outer limits of that. But with that advice, I'll ask him to retake the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I guess meandering is an interesting word that my colleague wishes to use when we're talking about a pandemic that happened only once in 100 years and had extremely wide-reaching effects across all segments of Canadian society. And you know, certainly there have been multiple Conservative Party amendments put forward, 20 or so on a bill that is incredibly wide-ranging and had, and I think the relevance, Chair, is really related to the fact that it is important, exceedingly important, to underscore the impacts that this pandemic had on Canadians. And for one, as I began to say before there was a point of order, what I was suggesting was that there is this Liberal and NDP coalition government really ready to have a pandemic inquiry based on a private member's bill? Is that realistically the kind of shield that they wish to hide themselves behind when we know very clearly that part of the goal of...
Yes, Mr. Davies, on the point of order.
Well, Dr. Ellis is clearly outside the relevance on this issue because the issue of an advisory committee and an inquiry is in the next section. It's in section 3 of the bill. And if he's read the package, he knows that the NDP has submitted an amendment to create a public independent inquiry into COVID. And that's exactly the subject of the next section. So he is clearly beyond the scope of Section 2, and I would once again ask him to confine his comments to the purpose section and his own explaining why his own amendment is, which is as very, very fine. It's a fine point. It's one of words to prevent the risk of, to reduce as much as possible the risk of pandemic. I'm curious to hear his rationale behind that. In fact, I plan on supporting it. But certainly, if he's talking about the inquiry, that's in the next section.
Mr. Davies, just hang on a second. We got another point of order from Mr. Doherty, please.
Mr. Chair, with all due respect to our colleagues from Mr. Davies, I believe, you know, I've been part of many bills and reviews of many studies. I believe Mr. Ellis was merely stating the background and the purpose, or the background as to why CPC 1 is relevant to this study. So, and whether it's this committee or others, the chair has latitude, has given latitude to members, whether it's Liberal, NDP, Green, Bloc, or Conservatives, latitude to explain the rationale behind an amendment. And that's all that our colleague is doing. Now, explanations can be short or they can be long. Whatever it takes to adequately express the purpose behind an amendment. That's all my colleague is doing. And I think Mr. Davies is probably going to chime in with more point of orders today. It seems to be the way that things are going. But with all due respect, I think, Mr. Chair, you've done a good job. You have done a good job giving the latitude to allow our colleagues to express, whether it's us, whether it's the Libs in the next, any of theirs, or the NDP. There's an enormous amount of latitude that the chair will give a member to adequately express the purpose behind their amendment, or the mindset behind their amendment.
You want to your remarks on your point of order, Mr. Davies, please.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Did you have anything further to add with respect to your point of order?
Well, just that I think it's really important to reiterate what the amendment is here. The purpose of the act says to prevent the risk of and prepare for future pandemics. And Dr. Ellis is proposing that we amend this to, instead of to prevent the risk of, instead it's to reduce as much as possible the risk of. That is the narrow amendment that he is proposing here. And there's plenty, he's making a lot of comments that I think may be germane to other sections of the bill, but not to that particular amendment. So I know that there's wide latitude, but the latitude is anchored in the actual amendment before us. And he's, I think, going far beyond that latitude that is normally given. So I'd ask him to wrap up his comments. We can vote on this amendment and proceed to the other important concepts that he's raising.
Sorry, Dr. Ellis, but that is indeed a valid point of order. And if my ask of you is exactly as Mr. Davies has said, if you can confine your remarks to Clause 2 and to the amendment, that would be in order and appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. And, I mean, part of the difficulty of needing to explain everything in this particular committee, of course, is related to the Liberal NDP coalition, which what we have seen in this committee many times is that essentially we'll see often small conventions with the NDP member and the Liberals deciding what their next maleficent mode of action will be. And when we look at those style of things, that really relates to the fact then that those of us who are here to hold the NDP Liberal coalition government to account, that it requires significant explanation in order to have anything be done. And I would suggest to you that when future governments, should this incredibly ridiculous piece of legislation be adopted, that they would look very clearly about what the purpose of the act would be as suggested in the wording. And therefore, to have the NDP member continue to suggest that he is the arbiter and the only voice of good sense and reason would be an affront to significant
Mr.
democracy.
Davies, on the point of order.
We have well-established rules in our House and in committee about parliamentary language. I said no such thing. I did not set myself up to be the self-appointed arbiter of anything, and those are not words in my mouth, and that's an insulting attack and really, frankly, beneath the honourable member. I ask him to retract that, and once again, he continues to speak beyond the purpose of his amendment. Frankly, if the Conservatives wanted to redraft the purpose to deal with the issues that they're raising, they well could have. They did not. The narrow amendment before us and what I'm trying to listen to here is why preventing the risk of a pandemic is different than reducing as much as possible the risk of. That is the amendment that my honorable colleague put before us. He could have put in all sorts of other things in the purpose that he seems to want to talk to, but didn't ground those speaking points in an amendment, and that's what he's not permitted to do. But I would ask that we cease the personal shots. How a liberal conservative coalition, which frankly is actually incorrect, there is no liberal NDP coalition, but how that would possibly be relevant to preventing the risk of a pandemic versus reducing the risk of a pandemic is utterly beyond any right-thinking person. And I would ask, clearly the Conservatives are trying to filibuster this meeting. If we want to talk about good faith and bad faith,
point of personal privilege.
Before
Mr. Davies, we have a point of personal. Mr. Davies, we have a point of personal.
There's no such thing as a point of personal privilege, Mr. Chair, and it certainly has not does not take precedence by interrupting a point of order. I have the floor on the point of order. So, he's insulted the drafter of this bill, who has every right as a member of this House of Commons, and by the way, sent to this chamber by the people of his riding, like we all were, after Dr. Ellis made a passionate invocation of democracy and why we're all here because of people. He's right about that. And Mr. Erskine-Smith has every right to put this bill. He's already cast aspersions that Mr. Erskine-Smith wasn't actively promoting the bill or not, which is a slur against Mr. Erskine-Smith. He's not even here to defend himself. This is outrageous what the Conservatives are doing, gumming up this health committee by preventing it from dealing with the the business before us, which is a very important piece of private members' business that Mr. Erskine-Smith has every right to table and to have us consider. And if the Conservatives just want to filibuster and prevent this committee from dealing with this legislation, then I guess we can't stop them. But what we can do is make sure that they do it within the confines of the rules of this committee and the rules of Parliament, which is to speak with relevance to the matter under consideration. If they were not organized enough to put in amendments that would ground the kind of discussion that they want to have, then that's a deficiency on their part. But it is not permissible in this committee to allow a member to talk about all sorts of irrelevant issues beyond their own amendment. And I would ask that you call Dr. Ellis to order, have him wrap up his comments, we can vote on this section and move forward on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. I've tried. Mr. Majumdar, please.
To describe the Conservative effort to place opioids and economic recovery, as Dr. Ellis has been passionately describing as a filibuster, is, I think, irresponsible, because at the end of the day, I mean, Mr. Davies is protecting his NDP Liberal friends and cover-up as opposed to actually pursuing a genuine, comprehensive review of a pandemic. So I'd like to see Mr. Davies retract his comment on that.
Back to you, Dr. Ellis. Please, if you could stay on the topic. You've made a very compelling presentation as to the reasons to vote in favor of CPC 1, but I would ask you to stay on the topic, but you do indeed have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Chair. And it's interesting that my colleague from the NDPs doesn't like to be called the arbiter, although he continues to raise points of orders and attempt to direct the chair of this committee as to how the business should be conducted. I would suggest that Canadians would find nothing more important after living now 3.5 years under a pandemic with the significant potential always when we see members from Health Canada appearing with masks on, sitting 6 feet apart, with that continued threat to move back into masking mandates and the requirement to shut down businesses, to have children schooled remotely, et cetera, I would suggest that understanding the exact purpose of this is very, very important. My colleague from the NDP, of course, would know very clearly, having a legal background, I understand, that words do matter, that the difference between reducing and preventing could significantly mean the loss of billions and perhaps trillions of dollars to the Canadian economy and how we actually conduct business in this country, how children are schooled in this country, how people get to socialize in this country, and how healthcare is delivered in this country, et cetera, And indeed, in the massive scope of this illegitimate bill, we understand indeed how food is grown in this country. This has significant impacts on the agriculture industry, and to continue on to say that a wording inside the purpose really doesn't make much difference, I would suggest to the members of this committee that it does. And we do know that there were significant concerns brought forward by people like the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, the Canadian Cattle Association, the Canadian Pork Council, and the others to understand their significant concern with the bill's impact on the Canadian animal agriculture sector with things that come forward further on in this bill. So if we don't get the wording of the purpose of this bill appropriate from the very beginning, then I would suggest to this committee that if we talk about the word preventing a pandemic versus reducing the likelihood of a pandemic, that there would be a significant problem as to how many of these measures could potentially be brought forward in an incredibly draconian way, especially when we know that the significant idea the significant idea that is brought forward by this Liberal government, which we saw during the heydays, if I can use that word, of the pandemic, were realistically related to the need to divide Canadians and to call them names such as misogynistic and racist. And when those divisions are sowed, I would suggest to you that there is significant and considerable hurt feelings that exist amongst many, many Canadians in all different parts of this country. So for my honourable colleague to suggest that getting the wording around prevention versus reducing the likelihood of future pandemics on a worldwide basis would be absolutely essential to how we move forward with respect to this bill. And when we begin to look at reducing the likelihood, again, it can't be underscored enough, Chair, to really be very, very clear with the need to say to people, what is the freedom that you have as a Canadian? What is your personal choice when you begin to understand that if we're talking about prevention of a particular illness versus reducing the likelihood therein? You know, for instance, if we were going to prevent illnesses, maybe we should just lock everybody up at home and make them stay there and give them significant amounts of government money. Oh, well, wait a minute, we already tried that, and when we tried that, we know that printing money flooded the economy and caused this significant high, 40-year inflation high that we now have with interest rates set by the Bank of Canada at 5%. We also know that the fallout from that has been absolutely incredibly bone-crushing to the finances of everyday Canadians. People come up to me every day, Chair, and they say, I don't know how when my mortgage comes up to be renewed that I'm going to be able to afford the payments on the interest. So not just not reducing the principal amount, but what we're talking about is really the inability to even make the interest payments. And when we begin to hear those things, to suggest that there is no relevance, or I should keep my comments short about prevention or reducing a pandemic, I find that an affront. And again, I will suggest that allowing one member to think that they are the arbiter of verbiage inside this committee and time limits inside this committee is an absolute thing that cannot be tolerated. So when we look at the prevention versus reducing the likelihood comment, what we know very clearly is that the printing of money that was handed out during the pandemic was a bad idea. There's no other word for it. Let's just be honest in committee and not try to use fancy trumped up language, but just to understand that it was a bad idea. And there's people out there who would say it's necessary. Well, maybe if we looked at the concept of reducing the likelihood versus prevention, then maybe other people could be challenged, such as those folks from the banks, major banks of Canada that we invited to come here, and other economists that we invited to come here to have their say with respect to how illegitimate and ridiculous this particular bill is. Then we wouldn't be in this position now 3.5 years after the start of the fateful day on March 13th, 2020, wherein the pandemic was deemed to have hit Canadian shores. And now what we know very clearly is related to the fact that the mortgages of Canadians have doubled since that time, that the price of an apartment has doubled in that time. We know that the cost of goods has inflated to the point where Canadians are really wondering, as winter is coming, we wonder whether Canadians will be able to feed their families, keep a roof over their head, and heat their homes. And this is all related to the fact that perhaps the difficulty was simply related to the Canadian Liberal government at that time taking a decision to attempt to prevent as opposed to reduce the likelihood. So when we begin to look at all of these incredible things that have happened with respect to the lives of Canadians, and you know, Mr. Speaker, having served the public for a very long part of my life and beginning to understand that now people will call our offices as members of Parliament And I know that across the aisle, folks over there are getting the same phone calls that we are. They have to be getting the same phone calls unless they've created some sort of wild conspiracy that only conservatives are now suffering. But we know very clearly that every Canadian is suffering with respect to the cost of living crisis that is continuing because of the actions of printing money of this government, that I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, certainly may be related to the idea of an attempt to prevent as opposed to reduce the likelihood of a pandemic. And so when we look at these comments to understand whether we believe that speaking out on behalf of all Canadians is germane or useful or should be time limited or needs to be lectured upon by somebody else in this committee who thinks that they have a better idea, that wants to get on to amendments that they have proposed, when we know very clearly that the NDP Liberal coalition continues to vote together. And so therefore we know that we need to underline and underscore and underpin the arguments that we have, which are related to very specific wording on behalf of Canadians, are absolutely paramount to the arguments that we put forward. And I guess that continuing to suggest that that an argument around one particular word is a waste of time or is not a waste of time, realistically, Chair, that really holds no water for me, because I do believe that words are important. And we already heard some inflammatory words earlier on today from another member attending this committee, and we know that words do matter. We know that on behalf of Canadians who elected the 338 of us to be here to simply represent them in the House of Commons, we know that when they reach out to us and they tell us that they are suffering and that they already know that when they put oil in their fuel barrel this winter, that it will cause them significant pain. We know very clearly that when they spend $1,000 on putting oil in their fuel tank, which will certainly not last, probably, it depends on the winter, of course, and oddly enough, we know it's snowing already in Edmonton. I had a message from my brother this morning that there was snow on his deck, and that is a significant problem. So very clearly we know that the carbon taxes added to $1,000 worth of oil, which is essential.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
It is
Point of order.
absolutely essential for Atlantic Canadians
Thank you very
to
much,
have this.
Mr. Chair.
Excuse me, Dr. Ellis.
Just confirming
Mr.
that we're
Fisher.
still on CPC 1 amendment.
Can I have a glass of water?
Yes, the debate is on CPC 1, an amendment to Clause 2.
Which is just a change of a couple words, right?
That's right.
Okay, thank
Yep.
you.
Dr. Ellis, I think the point was made indirectly that you are now well beyond the limits of relevance, and I'd ask you to bring it back. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I thank the honourable member across the aisle for again underscoring the fact that clearly when I mentioned the relevance of prevention versus reducing the likelihood that they were not paying clear enough attention. Therefore, back to the carbon tax, Mr. Chair, we know that putting $1,000 worth of oil into an oil barrel for an essential service this winter
Point of order.
for Canadians,
point of order.
Canadians
Dr.
specifically.
Pelosi on the point of order.
Although I'm enjoying his filibustering, I'm not sure what relevance the carbon tax has to his suggested amendment.
Yes, I don't think that point is getting through despite our best efforts. Dr. Ellis, please, on the amendment.
Thank you, Chair. I'm very happy that Dr. Pelosi brought forward the relevance of the carbon tax. And if I weren't continuously interrupted by points of orders, or as Mr. Davies would have me say, not interrupted, but points of orders proclaimed during my speech, it would be very clear that 1,000, and I'll say it, I've started it 3 or 4 times now, but I will say it again, that $1,000 worth of home heating fuel, which is essential to the survival of Atlantic Canadians and many other Canadians across this great country, has more than 23 cents, sorry, yes, $230, so 23% carbon tax attached to it. And so when we look at what Canadians are now trying to do is that they are trying to take their already taxed income and fuel their vehicles, which we know in Atlantic Canada, the difficulty is related to
Mr. Speaker,
the
point of
ability
order.
that we have when we live very
Point of order
rurally.
from Mr. Fisher.
I know you clarified that this was the First Amendment, but is this still C-293, an act respecting pandemic prevention?
Yes, indeed it is. Dr. Ellis, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, and again, the point, of course, is related to prevention or reducing the likelihood of a pandemic. And when we look at the devastating effects that this Liberal government policies during the pandemic with respect to economics had and continues to have on this member's riding in Atlantic Canada, because we know very clearly that when his constituents need to do things, there's a much greater likelihood that they are required to drive a car to get there. And again, that punishing carbon tax has added at least 16 cents to a liter of fuel to their
Point of order,
vehicles.
Mr. Chair.
And the
Order-
difficulty...
Point of order from Dr. Hanley.
With respect, the content of what Dr. Ellis is describing is irrelevant to the motion on the amendment.
I agree with your point of order and ask Dr. Ellis to limit his comments to those that are relevant to what is before the committee at this time. Dr. Ellis?
Well, thank you very much, Chair. And I know that the member from the Yukon, I know that the people who he serves are also suffering significantly from the punishing carbon tax that he has voted for, I don't know, 23 or 24 times.
Point of order,
and I
Mr.
think
Chair.
that when we
Point of
continue
order
to
from
consider
Mr.
those
Davies.
things,
Mr. Chair, this, by my count, is at least the fifth time that you have called Dr. Ellis to order and asked him to reminded him of the rule of relevancy, and he just ignores you. Each and every time you call him and rule him to be irrelevant and ask him to speak to the issue, he continues to go right back to speaking on the very point and the very subject that he has just been ruled irrelevant. I would ask that if he continues to do it or does it one more time, that he lose his speaking spot and you move to the next speaker. If he refuses to respect the rulings of the chair, if he insists on speaking on irrelevant subjects after being called to order repeatedly, then he himself is disqualifying himself from speaking on this matter. We cannot allow Dr. Ellis to continue to filibuster this bill and this committee by speaking on irrelevant subjects. If he can speak to, he's permitted to filibuster and to speak at length, as torturous as it may be, but he is not entitled to ignore the rule of relevancy. And I'm concerned that...
Okay, Mr. Davies, just
after
hang
doing
on
this
one
5
second.
times-
Now, I want to deal with this. Mr. Majumdar is again raising what he calls a point of personal privilege. So I want to deal with this right now, and then I'm going to come back to you. I do not, as a committee chair, have the power to rule on points of privilege. If there is a point of privilege raised here, it's something that has to be brought back to the House. I am concerned that a so-called point of personal privilege is being used as an opportunity to interrupt someone who is on a point of order. So I just wanted to make that clear. Mr. Majumdar, if you have a point of order, that does indeed take precedence, but a point of personal privilege is not something that can be dealt with, or a point of privilege is not something that can be dealt with by committee except to refer it to the House. Back to you, Mr. Davies. Sorry for the interruption.
Thank you. Yeah, so, you know, when Dr. Ellis is repeatedly called to order by, you know, speaking about the carbon tax, when we're talking about reducing the simple grammatical change of preventing the risk of a pandemic versus reducing the risk of it, and you repeatedly rule that that is irrelevant and you uphold the point of order, but he just ignores that and continues to speak as if their ruling was not made. I find that to be unacceptable, and there must be a consequence of this. Dr. Ellis is permitted to filibuster, as he clearly wants to do, but he still has to respect the rules of relevancy, and that's a little bit harder to do. He's not entitled to talk about any subject under the sun, no matter how irrelevant it is to the subject at hand. And I'm just saying that having done it at least 5 times now, ignoring your ruling, there must be a consequence. And I'm calling on you next time it happens to recognize the next speaker if Dr. Ellis refuses to respect your continued rulings on relevancy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Davies. I'm not sure that I have the power to take the floor away from him. I am going to consult on that, the point that you make is valid. There have been repeated valid points of order with respect to relevance that are being ignored. The tools that I have to deal with them, like I say, I'm going to consult, but I fear that they are limited. Dr. Ellis.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. And again, I would point out that this member continues to direct the Chair in the NDP Liberal Coalition style and suggests the confidence and supply agreement may be in jeopardy. That being said, I certainly believe the relevance of talking about the carbon tax because, once again, I think I've made it very clear, but obviously the NDP member is not listening clearly enough. Perhaps he could turn up his headset. But when we're talking about preventing or reducing the likelihood, what the importance that needs to be underscored here, which is exceedingly relevant despite his continued attempts at censorship, the exceedingly relevant point really is related to the harm that could potentially be created for Canadians with respect to preventing something, which is exceedingly strong language, or reducing the likelihood. And just because of the fact that the member doesn't like me speaking and wishes to have me censored does not really make any relevant sense in the style of government that we have. No matter how much I don't like things that other people say, it is still their opportunity and their obligation, especially if it were on behalf of their constituents, to have the ability to say it. And therefore, I would suggest that any attempt at censorship, especially under the direction of the NDP member towards the Liberals in their costly coalition, would be a significant attempt to undermine the great democratic traditions that we have. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I will return to prevention versus reducing the likelihood and the drastic effects that need to be underscored that in a vain and inappropriate attempt to prevent a pandemic, that what we have come to now is a society that is in considerable jeopardy with respect to their home finances. And again, that carbon tax, which could be removed, is continuing to punish Canadians significantly because we know very clearly, as mentioned, that out of $1,000 put into a barrel of oil this particular winter for Atlantic Canadians, we know that that will cost them an extra almost $250 to simply put that oil in their oil barrel, which is an essential part of living in the majority of Canada throughout the winter. Now, we also live in single-family dwellings, which are often old, which creates significant problems when it relates to heating a home. Certainly, it's less efficient, and I think looking for those particular opportunities related to that would be helpful. But we also live rurally because that's what we choose, and we also know very clearly that to get places, as I mentioned, it is essential to drive, which when we look at the 16 cents a litre added to the cost of every liter of fuel put in a vehicle, which will purportedly increase to 61 cents if this costly coalition of NDP Liberal government is not stopped, will be there will be an utter inability for Canadians to afford their lives. They will be essentially priced out of their lives. And, you know, I've had the great fortune to be born here in Canada 55 years ago. And as I said, spent many of those years in service to the public. But never before have I heard the incredible numbers, the painstaking, heartbreaking, stories that all of us hear, and I know that on this side of the House, all of my colleagues hear the exact same stories from constituents calling them on a regular basis related to how am I going to afford to feed my family, to keep a roof over my head, and to heat my dwelling in the wintertime. So the heating, of course, adds to the already significant and dangerous financial situation which we find ourselves as Canadians. And so when we talk about relevance, that is particularly why it is very relevant, Mr. Chair, when we talk about the financial position that a vain attempt to divide and distract Canadians ended Canadians up with a significant and dire financial position with 40-year high inflation and interest rates that, according to the Prime Minister, would never be high, and that people should live in fantasy land with fairy dust and unicorns and buy whatever they chose to do. We know that that has contributed significantly to the financial position in which Canadians are at the current time. And I do believe that there is significant relevance, Chair, related to introducing the carbon tax argument on top of that, because it is a significant part of the negative financial implications of what has happened in Canada at the current time. And we know very, very clearly that what do we hear from Canadians now? We hear from Canadians that they want no more carbon tax on what they have to purchase. As we know, when you tax the farmer that grows the food and you tax the trucker that ships the food, then there's going to be even more cost passed on to the consumer who has
Point of order,
to buy
Mr.
the
Chair.
food. Because otherwise, if they don't buy the food, then
Point
of
of order
course...
from Dr. Hanley.
The subject to which Dr. Ellis is speaking is not relevant to the amendment, and I ask that we stick to the text of the amendment and proceed in the interests of the House of Commons, all of the guests who are here, and any Canadians who might be left patiently waiting for progress of this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hanley. In House of Commons procedure and practice, at page 101059, it reads that this is with respect to committees and questions of procedure and privilege. In the event of disorder, the chair may suspend the meeting until order can be restored, or if the situation is considered to be so serious as to prevent the committee from continuing with its work, the meeting may be adjourned. In addition, the chair may, at his or her discretion, interrupt a member whose observations and questions are repetitive or are unrelated to the matter before the committee. If the member in question persists in making repetitive or off-topic comments, the chair can give the floor to another member. If the member refuses to yield the floor and continues talking, the chair may suspend or adjourn the meeting. So I do have that power as contained in the House of Commons procedure and practice. I'm not yet ready to invoke it, although there is disagreement on the committee with respect to the relevance of Dr. Ellis's address. He is talking about the intent of the bill. He is talking about the connection to the pandemic. He is wandering far afield, but I don't find, at least at this stage, that it warrants such rare and high-handed, arguably, conduct on the part of the chair. I offer this detail to say that from time to time, Dr. Ellis, you're getting close, and I'm awful tempted to use the power, but I'm not ready to do it yet. I would ask you once again to confine your remarks to the specific clause under consideration. Thank you.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
Un appel à règlement.
A point of order, Mr. Thériault. Yes, Mr. Chair. In fact, Mr. Ellis is monopolizing the floor on one first clause And for myself, and I really would like to thank him for all of his enlightening remarks. I hope I would like to thank him for all of clarifying, because I think we're really going to save a lot of time for the other amendments of the Conservative Party, because he is telling us, and he's been very lengthy in his explanation about how all of the Conservative amendments were written, so I would like to thank him for that. But I'm ready to vote for his amendment, and for a long time, and I think that there are others also that would like to vote for that, and quickly. So I would like to remind you that it would be interesting if we could have the floor other than through a point of order. He is monopolizing the floor through his amendment, and it's really not necessary, because it's not necessary, because I'm ready to vote for it, and it's been a long time now.
Well, I thank my bloc colleague for understanding the difficulties. The unfortunate part is, of course, is that the prevention versus reduction in likelihood appears still to be lost on some of my colleagues, especially when they utterly refuse to understand the connection, of course, between prevention and the flooding the economy with significant amounts of money, which, of course, has caused 40-year highs in inflation and have caused interest rates to climb precipitously, which, of course, we're waiting for another interest rate hike, or at least perhaps a stabilization at the very least amount of damage coming up. I believe it's overnight Wednesday night. But that being said, I think it is important that people begin to understand that their actions that they have has a trickle-down effect, and it continues to negatively affect the potential difficulties that Canadians are suffering from when they understand that flooding the economy with money jacks up the inflation rate, which causes Canadians to have less money in their pocket. And then when you add a punishing and escalating carbon tax on top of that, 16 cents up to 61 cents a litre on gasoline, that there is significant relevance there, and that they need to begin to consider whether they need to continue to vote for carbon tax increases in the future, which we know that the member from Avalon was the only Conservative member who decided to vote against the only Liberal member, very good, the only Liberal member. Of course, every Conservative member voted against the carbon tax during the last Opposition Day motion. We also know very clearly that prevention versus reducing the likelihood can have a significant negative effect on those suffering with addictions. And we know that when people are suffering with addictions, especially when times are difficult, the likelihood will increase. We also know that continued mismanagement from this government will suggest that now provincial governments is relieving the Board of Directors and senior management at the South Riverdale Community Health Centre of their duties following a critical incident review. And we know that when these things begin to happen, we know that Canadians are suffering greatly with respect to their own personal lives and their finances. And Mr. Chair, I do really wish to thank you for the latitude that you've given me, but I would like to say that I hope that this continued need to underscore the fact that words matter will not be necessary in the future, in spite of the fact that I know that it's probably lost on the Liberal NDP coalition, and that they will sadly vote against this particular amendment, and that we will continue to have to go back to such things in the future. And therefore, I would like to thank the indulgence of the chair to underscore what words are important, such as prevention or reducing the likelihood, and now would suggest to my colleagues that I would be happy to cede the floor.
Dr. Ellis, are there any, Dr. Pawlowski, please.
Well, it certainly came with a lot of unnecessary window dressing, but let me actually confine my remarks to the amendment itself. And in the spirit of collegiality and brevity, which has thus far marked the proceedings, I would actually say I agree with Dr. Ellis. And I would like to, however, add a little something, because Yeah, it'll be pretty short, because it may be the only time, no, it's not the carbon tax, but it's the one time I get the floor. And so I have to say, because I know we all know what's going on here, but when this bill first came forward, I too had real reservations about it, in that, come on, and some of us, a lot of us were part of the COVID committee that sat through COVID. There was a lot of discussions. There's a lot of things that were relevant. And to do this and address this in a PMB seemed a bit much. No, not a bit much, a lot much. However, I've come to change my mind about it, because what this bill does is fundamentally require the government to come up with the pandemic preparedness plan and to make that public. Now, yes, it's going through, as a PMB, it kind of circumvents the normal process, but it's going to get out there, and we're going to know what plan exists. And you and the opposition will have a chance to reply to that plan. And I don't see a quicker way of getting that plan out. So I would suggest that this is, and the Conservative response to this is basically suggesting to me that they don't want us to have a public pandemic preparedness plan, which I think is in our interest, and I think it's in the Conservative, I think it's in all of our best interests. So I just wanted to get that out before I cede the floor. Thanks.
Mr. General, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And not to belabor the point, but I appreciate what Mr. Pawlowski brought up, and do want to say this in the context that understand the of NDP 1 amendment looking at the inquiry, but being as that this is the first clause of the beginning of the bill that we're looking at, addressing just that fact. I haven't been convinced, as Mr. Pawlowski has been, but what we went through during the pandemic, and there are many people around the table, Ms. Sadu, Mr. Pawlowski, Mr. Theriault, Mr. Davies, myself, when we were told consistently over and over again that this is what we're doing now, but don't worry, there will be a plan, there will be an inquiry. So again, knowing that we're going to move on to Don's amendment soon to vote on, I just want to raise it now before we get too far into the bill at the purpose level, that having a private members bill address this was certainly, I don't think, the intent of the people around the table. Sorry, I forgot about Mr. Fisher. Of course, he was there too. It wasn't the intent that we heard, particularly in opposition, that this is how things were going to be addressed. And I think there was a lot of good faith at the time, Mr. Chair, that there was going to be something more substantial. And what I really, really worry about is that the government won't bring forward something now, knowing that they have this to be able to point to. And we've already seen that with the minister pointing to this during some of the testimony that, you should say the previous minister, during some of his testimony, saying that there's no need to talk about the pandemic because this is coming forward. So, you know, I won't belabor the point, but just wanted to state it at the outset that that this alone, a private members bill, is, you know, I know Nate's probably listening in on the webcast, and you know, he's a good friend, and you know, this isn't personal, but ultimately, you know, at the end of the day, this isn't what I think not only us as opposition were sold in good faith, but also the general public.
Mr. Davies?
Thank you. Well, on the narrow issue of the amendment, I support it, and I think, frankly, all that needed to be said was the explanation of why it's better wording to describe the purpose. My narrow point will be
Point of order, Chair.
Dr. Ellis, on a point of order.
I think the chair has been very clear that we wish members to be brief. And you know what? Having heard my own self-talk for a very long time, Chair, I would suggest that is this member really going to add something? If he's going to vote for the motion anyway, maybe he could just not say anything, and that would be nice and brief.
Not a point of order, not helpful. Mr. Davies, please.
Thank you. The irony of a speaker who just took you know, the better part of an hour speaking, interrupting someone after 30 seconds is breathtaking. But on the purpose of this, it says The reason I support the amendment is because the current language says the purpose of the act is to prevent the risk of a future pandemic. I don't actually think you can prevent the risk. I think the language that's been proposed is good because it says the purpose of the act is to reduce as much as possible the risk. And I think that's actually aligned with reality. I don't think you can ever prevent a risk, but you can reduce it. And that's why I think that it's a good amendment, and I plan on supporting it.
The speakers list, like your chair, is exhausted. So are we ready for the question? Shall CPC 1 carried? Shall it carry? Yes. All those, I see unanimity around the table. Mr. Davies, please.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I just was getting in line to speak on the next clause because it's my motion.
Before we get to your motion, the only amendment proposed for Clause 2 was CPC 1, so we are now ready to consider Clause 2 as amended. Are there any submissions with respect to Clause 2 as amended? Seeing none, shall Clause 2 as amended carry? I see consensus. Clause 2 is carried. That brings us to Clause 3. The first amendment to Clause 3 is NDP number 1. Mr. Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, this clause has been a subject of discussion among the committee for a long time, and I think we've all come to a broad consensus, I think, that on all sides, I think, Liberals, Conservatives, Bloc, and NDP, that the current clause is not acceptable as it is because, in short, what it purports to do is to provide the Minister of Health with the ability to establish an advisory committee to review the response to the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada. For a variety of reasons, that is not acceptable, nor I think advisable. For one, the Minister of Health is the minister in charge of the Public Health Agency of Canada, and that's the lead agency which is designed for the express purpose of and charged with the responsibility of preparing for pandemics and large-scale public health issues and dealing with them. So the prospect of having the Minister of Health, who's ultimately responsible for that preparedness, choose the people who would review his very conduct is a direct conflict of interest and is unacceptable on that ground alone. The other thing I think is fair to remind all committee members is that I undertook to work with Parliamentary Council to determine whether or not we could remove this clause and replace it with a better kind of COVID inquiry. And we sort of went back and forth. I think my last report to committee was that it was difficult to do. The Legislative Council was concerned about whether such an amendment would be outside the scope of the bill, or conversely, whether or not it would require a royal recommendation. And I was just advised last week on Thursday by Legislative Council that an amendment actually could be made to do that. So I've decided to table that before committee. We may all remember that I think there was a broad consensus to remove Clause 3 completely from the bill in the event that we couldn't fix it. And so that's the alternate position. But I thought because the proposal to have the COVID inquiry is actually within the scope of the bill, I thought I would move it anyway so that my colleagues could have a chance to consider that and vote on it. And if it doesn't pass, then I will, of course, be moving an amendment, or will vote against the clause to remove it from the bill completely. So briefly, I just want to speak to what the clause does. I think all my colleagues have it. Essentially, it removes the advisory committee appointed by the Minister of Health and changes it to this: within 90 days after the day on which this act comes into force, an inquiry under Part 1 of the Inquiries Act must be undertaken into the response to the coronavirus disease 2019, COVID-19 pandemic in Canada. And in conducting the inquiry, the commissioners are charged with the very same scope of review that are currently in the bill, which I'm going to go over because I think it's important for us to understand. It says that those commissioners will, among other things, so it's important to note that it's inclusive, it's not restricted to the following, so the commissioners can go anywhere else they want, but specifically they're directed to the following: assess the capability of the Public Health Agency of Canada and the Department of Health to respond to the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic before and during the pandemic. B, in collaboration with provincial and municipal governments, assess the public health and pandemic response capabilities of those governments. And C, assess the effectiveness of the exercise of powers under any applicable federal laws before, during, and after the pandemic, and of the coordination of measures taken under those laws. And finally, analyze the health, economic, and social factors relevant to the impact of the pandemic in Canada. Just to read those, I think, underscores how profoundly important and broad the inquiry could be. It will look at everything about the COVID-19 pandemic and the way that the federal government and the other governments that it worked in coordination with handled it. So why I think this is important is that an inquiry under the Inquiries Act satisfies what the NDP has been calling for from the beginning, and I think other parties have as well, which is that any inquiry into the COVID-19 pandemic is essential. We need to have an impartial, independent, public, and properly resourced inquiry to undertake this work. And the reason for this is, the reasons are several. One is, if we don't take the time to learn the lessons of the last pandemic, we will not be as prepared for the next one. It was said many times in the pandemic that we shouldn't waste a crisis. Well, we had one of the most profoundly disrupting crises of a century, and I think we need to understand the lessons of that. Number two, accountability. That's not the same as blame. We're not looking to blame anybody. An inquiry does not find blame. An inquiry has no powers to find blame. What it does, though, is it holds the parties and organizations that are responsible for protecting the public accountable for that. So if we don't have an inquiry, we don't have that accountability. I would point out that an inquiry under the Inquiries Act has the powers that I think are essential. It has the power to subpoena documents. It has the power to compel the attendance of witnesses, and it is resourced and is assisted by counsel. All of those things I think are critical for the one overarching goal, which I think is we must all keep in mind as parliamentarians, which is the confidence of the public. This pandemic, it should not be, and this inquiry should not be a partisan exercise. It should be one that looks at a whole of government response and determine what was done well, what was not done well. Where were the acts of commission, the acts of omission, and ultimately to come up with a series of recommendations so that we can fix this problem, be much better, fix is too strong, be better prepared for the next pandemic, which experts routinely tell us is not a matter of if, but when. A couple of final observations. During the pandemic, I worked closely with my colleagues, some of whom are on this committee, and former colleagues like Michelle Rempel-Garner, who was the health critic at that time. And we all called for, or we all saw major errors made in the way we were prepared for it, the way we prepared for it, and the way we didn't prepare for it. We had a shortage of PPE. We had no real inventory system for personal protective equipment and other important resources that we would need in the case of pandemic. For some reason, we suspended the very, very excellent early warning system that was in public health that had been in place to give Canadians early warning of pandemics. We had early issues of whether or not masking was appropriate or not. We don't produce vaccines. There's a number of issues that need to be looked at. And there were a number of things that we did well as well. I think it's important to point that out as well. But we had at the time, every time one of the opposition parties raised this issue of trying to find out what's going on and hold people accountable and to find out how we can do better, we were told by various members of the Liberal government, including Minister Haidu, who is the then health minister, followed by Minister Duclos, who was her successor, and including Prime Minister Trudeau, that there would be time and place for that kind of assessment. But they said it was not then, and we accepted that. I remember my Conservative colleagues, my Bloc colleagues, the NDP colleagues, we accepted that when we were in the middle of a global pandemic and an emergency, that the first most important thing to do was to deal with that emergency, and that there would be a time and a place later when the emergency was under control for us to undertake that work. Colleagues, that time is now. The WHO has lifted the designation of the global pandemic. We are clearly past that time of emergency. I know that COVID is still with us and we have residual impacts, some of which are serious, but we are no longer in that emergency time. And I note that the UK is undertaking a public inquiry, and I note that the British Medical Journal, who has done a very deep dive into the way Canada handled our inquiry, also suggests that Canada undertake a public inquiry. So the real question then is, what kind of inquiry should we have? Should it be one appointed by the sitting government with people who are handpicked by that government, who are handpicked by the very person whose responsibilities may be in question? That clearly is not acceptable. It should be acceptable no matter what the hue of government is. It's just not structurally sound. And I think, and where I'll conclude is this, the most important people in this entire discussion is the Canadian public. And their confidence has been tested and it's been shaken. And the only way to restore confidence in the public is to have the courage to have a full, broad, root to branch, transparent, and searching public inquiry into how the COVID-19 pandemic was handled. And again, we do not want this to be a partisan circus. What we want this to be is a properly run inquiry. And the way we do that in Canada is with an inquiry under the Inquiries Act. Obviously, it will be a judge who will be appointed, who will be properly resourced, and who will have the parameters of the Inquiries Act legislation and the guidance of previous inquiries, which, by the way, I want to remind everybody, there were inquiries done after SARS. One was done in Ontario, and it wasn't an inquiry under the Inquiries Act federally, but there was a similar type of approach. And I think only by having that independent public searching inquiry can we actually make sure that the public can have confidence that the recommendations that come out of that inquiry are sound and they weren't tainted by political considerations by anybody of any hue, and that we can keep in mind the one overarching goal that all Canadians want, and we as a health committee, I think, share, which is that we want to be better prepared for next time. And so I'm going to ask my colleagues to support the NDP motion to replace this clause with the advisory committee appointed by the Minister of Health with a truly independent, public and transparent inquiry. And failing that, as I've said, I would rather that this clause be removed entirely if we don't actually make sure that we have the type of inquiry that I think we all know deep down is what is truly required in the circumstances. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. Monsieur Thériault, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do agree with Mr. Davies. I'm not going to go over his argument, but I would have a sub-amendment to propose. And I will read it to you. Our sub-amendment would be the NDP 1 be modified in the following fashion. Measures taken by the Government of Canada rather than measures taken in Canada. And I sent the amendment in French. I think it will be translated because the French version and the English version were not the same. And Mr. Chair, I would like to draw your attention and to the fact that on page 6, line 24, there we want to see whether if this were to be adopted, we'll have to modify the bill because it would no longer be an advisory committee, but rather a report of an inquiry from the Commission. And with respect to the arguments for the sub-amendment, I would like to draw your attention to the Inquiries Act, and I would like to read the government can, if they feel it's necessary, to go ahead with an inquiry on a commission of all actions of the Government of Canada in the matters of public management. And so here we're talking about the management of the Government of Canada, so I think it is important that we put that wording in that fashion. Those are my remarks, Mr. Chair.
D'accord.
Okay, thank you. So the sub-amendment is in good form. The debate will now be on the sub-amendment. And I hope that all of those who are not able to use both language did hear the translation, and that we now are going to have the question on the sub-amendment. Dr. Ellis.
Thank you very much, Chair. And having sat there for a couple of meetings, I know that this is going to be a real pain in the neck question. But can you read the sub-amendment, please?
Oh, oui, je l'ai. OK. En français,
So in French, the sub-amendment is that the NPD 1 be modified in the following fashion. In the phrase, the Act comes into force, and an inquiry under Part 1 of the Inquiries Act must be undertaken into the response to the coronavirus disease 2019 by the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada. To be taken out.
First is really the preamble.
We want to take away the words in Canada. So we want to take out the words in Canada and replace them with measures taken by the Government of Canada. That would be the amendment, the sub-amendment that was proposed.
Est-ce que c'est correct?
Is that correct, Mr. Chair? Oh, yes. Thank you. This is a substitution. It's a simple substitution of in Canada by the federal government.
Thank you very much, Chair, for redoing that. I know how difficult it is sitting there to do that. I guess part of the difficulty with the creation of the Inquiries Act is there's a couple of things. Number one is it entirely changes the meaning of this private members bill, which again will realistically make the rest of Part 1 rather ridiculous, trying to go through it. And I think that my colleague from the NDP has made it clear of the importance of private members' bills, since they often do not get to the floor of the House of Commons. Indeed, there's been people who have sat in the House of Commons for many years and not have a private member's bill. And certainly during my incredibly eloquent speech, I think he made it clear several times of how important private members' bills were. And this, in effect, would realistically negate the entire opportunity for this member to have a private member's bill. And I guess that if we really believe that there's absolutely no benefit to this, then why would we proceed? And perhaps I will have this wrong, but I would like to propose a sub-amendment to delete all words after the title of this bill.
First sub-amendment. Thank you, Dr. Ellis. The sub-amendment is not in order at this time. We have to deal with one sub-amendment at a time. So once this one is dealt with, it would be appropriate to raise it then, I believe, subject to any further advice. But just in terms of timing, it's out of order. I'm not going to rule on the substance of this sub-amendment until it's properly placed. So we're back to the sub-amendment proposed by Mr. Thériault, and Mr. Genereux is next on the list.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Because I intervened at the beginning on the purpose of this, those comments still stand for sure. Mr. Davies' amendment, in my opinion, is getting better. If you look at, we were initially looking at an advisory committee, and now under Mr. Davies' amendment, it is in fact an inquiry, which, as I mentioned earlier in today's meeting, that's certainly what we were told. However, I'm under the impression that there are, under the Inquiries Act, there are a variety of different inquiries, and that can take on a meaning by itself. The kind of the thing that stood out to me, and I'd be curious to Mr. Davies' comments if he looked into this at all when he was drafting this amendment, is the ability of a Royal Commission inquiry to be called on this. I know those have existed in the past, and they haven't for a while, but I'll just quickly read the definition of a Royal Commission. Royal Commissions tend to be thought of as broader in scope than other public inquiries, often holding nationwide public hearings and publishing associated research reports, as well as their formal findings and recommendations. And these have gone from everything in scope, from looking at the Liquor Traffic Act of Canada before, to the lobster industry, to tobacco trade. So I certainly would think something like the pandemic and its impact on Canadian citizens would be something worthy of a Royal Commission. And then I'll leave the Royal Commission piece there, but the other thing just want to raise as well is when it comes to, if this doesn't happen, if this inquiry is simply made as an advisory committee, I bet you for sure you will start to see a whole bunch of other provinces do their own inquiries. And there's a case to be made for a national inquiry on something of this magnitude, and to think that suddenly we're going to have a bunch of hearings across each province that will probably generate some good information, but ultimately use a plethora of resources that could be used elsewhere. I just think it's again, the risk of where this bill could take us in that scope of its work would be something. I would just caution the committee as we're about to consider voting on this. So I'll leave my comments there, Mr. Chair.
Are there any further? Oh yes, Dr. Pawlowski, please.
Out of respect for Don, who I have great respect for, The reason that I'm not in favor of having an inquiry through the Inquiries Act is I think this was such a huge, immense event that affected us all in so many ways, the economy, but people's lives in so many different ways. I would prefer to have an inquiry that wasn't limited, and as I think the Inquiries Act would be limited. I think we need a much broader analysis involving all levels of society as to what happened and what we can do better. So I think we can do better than the Inquiries Act, but I did want to respond to Don because, like I say, I have a lot of respect for him.
I see no further speakers. Are we ready for the question on the sub-amendment? So for clarity, the sub-amendment is to amend subsection 3 sub 1 to delete the words "in Canada" and replace them with the words "measures taken by the federal government." All those in favor of the sub-amendment?
Chair, I'd like to request a recorded division, please.
Okay, so a recorded vote has been requested. Madam Clerk.
Mr. Fisher? Mr. Hanley?
No.
Mr. Jawari?
No.
Mr. Pawlowski?
Abstain.
Ms. Sidhu? Mr. Ellis?
Abstain.
Mr. Doherty?
Abstain.
Mr. Majumdar?
Abstain.
Mr. General?
Abstain.
Monsieur Thériault? Mr. Davies?
Oui.
Two yeas, deux pour, 4 nays, 4 contre.
Sub-amendment is therefore defeated, and we are now on to the unamended amendment of Mr. Davies, NDP 1. Are there any further submissions with respect to NDP 1? Mr. Thériault.
Oui.
Yes, I would have another sub-amendment to propose. Just a moment. No, I'm okay. I'm good. That Bill C-293, that Bill C-293 in Clause 3 be amended by deleting public health at line 28 and 29 of page 22, or line 25 on page 2 in the English version. Thank you, Mr. Thériault. Could you please submit the sub-amendment in writing? I thought I had submitted it. Do we have it? In fact, go ahead, Mr. Thériault. And I think I will ask the legislative clerk to make a comment. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, what we're doing here is simply respecting the different competencies. And even though we're asking the collaboration of the provincial governments, we need to evaluate to assess public health. I think that Quebec has its own public health. Montreal has its public health, so they themselves can do their own evaluation with respect to assessing public health. but on the other hand, that we would collaborate and that we would evaluate our performance during the pandemic. That is fine. So what we're looking to do here is to take away public health to leave in the event of a pandemic. And I would like to let you know that Montreal Public Health was much more efficient than the federal public health at the airport, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau. Thank you, Mr. Thériault. We have received the draft version, and I would like to invite the clerk to tell everyone what you're proposing is an amendment, rather. So you have to do it later. It's not on the same line, so we have to look at what's on the same line. Oh yes, I'm sorry. I was obsessed with that we were going to get rid of everything. But can I ask a question to the clerk before we move ahead? To introduce into a private member's bill an inquiry with everything that it would represent in terms of expenses, and with a recommendation of a royal commission, even if we were to be to vote for it, could it be blocked at the end of the process? Well, we'd have to consult with a specialist, but within the law, there's not a new expense. It's already within the Act. That's what I thought. So that is the reason that we're talking about that particular Act rather than the argument that would be saying, well, let's do something different. Okay, so that becomes an argument to vote for if we really do want an inquiry. So I would just like everybody to note that it would be interesting if we did want one to attach this particular will within the bill, and that would be very coherent. Because we don't really know what will happen with all of the discussions. So I don't know that we have a sub-amendment, but rather another amendment that will be presented at another point. Thank you. Okay.
We are then back to the amendment proposed by Mr. Davies, NDP 1. I have Mr. Davies and Dr. Ellis on the speakers list. Mr. Davies, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, just a couple of quick points. Both of whom two colleagues I respect very much and who I think served on this committee through the pandemic, Mr. Genereux and Dr. Pelosi. To Mr. Genereux, yes, although the amendment doesn't prescribe it, it very well could take the form of a royal recommendation. If you think of where we've had inquiries before, whether it's into wrongful imprisonments or such other things, I think that if ever there was a subject that was perfectly appropriate for a royal inquiry, it would be into how we all handled together this COVID pandemic. We talked about it being once in 100 years. So I think if you don't have a public royal inquiry into something like this, it's hard for me to think of when one would. So I would say yes, absolutely, it could be a royal inquiry. Royal Commission. And to Dr. Pelosi, I just want to make clear that I totally respect his position on it. Reasonable people can have reasonable disagreements on these issues. I mean, I personally think that although it may not be perfect, to me, the whole purpose of an Inquiries Act is to set a mechanism for when we want to have an objective, arm's length examination of an issue of national importance. And that's what I think this is. And I think it's really, really critical that we take this out of the partisan field. A government is going to have a different lens on this and vision than the opposition will. They may join issue and find agreement on some things, but a government will naturally have a desire to kind of defend its actions. And I don't think that's a pejorative. It's just that's what governments do, and opposition may be at times have a different version critical. So that's why my whole rationale in proposing this amendment is to rise above the partisanship and find a nonpartisan mechanism. And I think that the beauty of having a public inquiry is that these things are done in public. A royal commission, it can go out into the communities across the country. It can televise. It can take submissions from the public, and it can examine all of the issues in a very courageous way. And so I just want to make clear that, you know, if people don't think that's the appropriate way to go, I respect that. And, you know, reasonable people can have disagreement on that. But I personally feel very much that this is needed in our country.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. Just before I go to Dr. Ellis, because he may want to address this in his remarks, if NDP 1 is adopted, CPC 2 and CPC 3 cannot be moved because they seek to amend the same line, so there's a line conflict. House of Commons Procedure and Practice states it's at page 769, amendments must be proposed following the order of the text to be amended. Once a line of a clause has been amended by the committee, it cannot be further amended, and a subsequent amendment as a given line may be amended only once. So just, Dr. Ellis is going to speak next, but before we get to a vote, you need to be aware that there is a line conflict if NDP 1 is adopted that would prevent us from dealing with CPC 1 and CPC 2. Dr. Ellis.
Thank you very much, Chair. The South Riverdale Supervised Injection Site has been operating since 2017. It is located in Leslieville, a neighborhood in Toronto. The site was in the media this summer when Carolina Hubner Macarat died after being hit by a stray bullet outside the location. We have now learned that the Ford government has taken over the Leslieville drug site, that the Ministry of Health installs a supervisor and begins a comprehensive review of the community health clinic. We also know that this Liberal government, with the support of the NDP, are funding this site. According to the South Riverdale's most recent financial report, the federal government, through Health Canada, provided nearly $2 million in federal funding to this location. This must be addressed by this committee urgently. I will table the following motion, that the committee undertake 4 meetings on the South Riverdale Supervised Injection Site and safe injection programs and facilities across Canada and review the federal government's involvement in this program and funding that has been allotted, and that the committee hear from the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions of Canada and the Minister of Health, Health Canada officials, and any other officials deemed relevant to the study.
We have a point of order from Ms. Sidhu.
Is this relevant to the topic, Mr. Chair?
It isn't relevant to the topic, but I'd like him to finish his submission because he can move a motion under certain circumstances. But your point with respect to relevance is a valid one. Please go ahead, and you were in the middle of reading either a motion or a notice of motion, Dr. Ellis. Please continue, and then if we need to deal with relevance, we can, but at least we want to hear you out first.
Thank you very much, Chair. I will start a bit back just to give some context again. According to the South Riverdale's most recent financial report, the federal government, through Health Canada, provided nearly $2 million in federal funding to this location. This must be addressed urgently by this committee. Therefore, I table the following motion, that the committee undertake 4 meetings on the South Riverdale Supervised Injection Site and safe injection programs and facilities across Canada and review the federal government's involvement in this program and funding that has been allotted, and that the committee hear from the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions of Canada, the Minister of Health, Health Canada officials, and any other witnesses deemed relevant to the study. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. When you say you're tabling the motion, I take that as to mean that you are providing notice of motion. If that's the case, that's fine. We can move on. If what you meant to say was that you're moving the motion, then we have a problem because there's no notice.
Thank you very much, Chair. And certainly I think that it's become very clear that this committee at the current time is not wanting to talk about opioids, even though they are germane to the pandemic. That being said, of course, in hearing the rulings that you have provided previously, I think it would be kind of foolish to continue to flog that horse, and therefore this would be a motion that is tabled, a notice of motion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ellis. Is there any further debate or discussion with respect to NDP 1? Seeing none, are we ready for the question?
We'd like a recorded vote, please,
A
Chair.
recorded vote has been requested on NDP 1. Madam Clerk?
Mr. Fisher? No. Mr. Hanley?
No.
Mr. Jawari?
Oppose.
Mr. Pawlowski?
Against?
Madame Sidhu? Mr. Ellis?
Abstain.
Mr. Generou?
Change in order. Abstain.
Mr. Doherty?
Abstain.
Mr. Majumdar? Monsieur Thériault? Mr. Davies?
Oui.
Two yeas, deux pour, 5 nays, 5 contre.
NDP 1 is therefore defeated. The next amendment is then CPC 2. Is there someone that wishes to move CPC 2? Dr. Ellis.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and certainly I really hope that this will ring true with our bloc colleague and hopefully with everybody else, actually. We know very clearly that there is a significant intersection between federal and provincial jurisdiction. And we actually heard from experts during the limited amount of testimony that was given to this incredibly far-reaching bill, which I would suggest having more witnesses here to understand exactly the considerable reach of the pandemic with respect to things like federal and provincial jurisdiction, which, having been a physician at that time running a regional inpatient COVID unit, I would suggest that there were significant differences of opinion often, and perhaps at the very least a mildly contradictory view as to what was being recommended by the federal government and what was being recommended by their provincial colleagues. And so beginning to understand that there are jurisdictional issues that continue to pop up their heads during this debate is, I think, exceedingly important, so that Canadians can be assured that the advice and direction that they are being given is consistent across the country. And I would suggest that that is something that we actually suffer with across the country, is differences in jurisdictional ideas, and indeed, from a medical care perspective, a significant patchwork of medical care exists across the country at the current time. For instance, pharmacare, the great province of Nova Scotia has a pharmacare bill which is accessible to any member of the public. And we know then that the NDP Liberal Coalition are, by reports of the media, including members of this committee, working very, 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 very closely together to come up with a national single-payer pharmacare system, which would significantly disadvantage those of us who live in Nova Scotia who already have a pharmacare program that is accessible by all. And that would mean, therefore, in the limited numbers of federal government dollars would be transferred to other provinces and jurisdictions which have not yet, for whatever reason, been able to or seen fit to undertake a scoped program such as exists in Nova Scotia. And we know very clearly that this also ties closely to the federal dental care bill, which would again disadvantage Nova Scotians having already had a program for folks for children ages 14 and under, which was funded by the provincial government. The $650 per child amount, which flows to other jurisdictions in this country, does not end up flowing to Nova Scotians, which again means that federal dollars are going to other jurisdictions as opposed to provinces like Nova Scotia, who has already created a program. Therefore, I would suggest that jurisdictional issues are incredibly important, and that if we begin to understand the necessity to be very clear when talking about a program of this incredible magnitude, which the Liberal colleagues have voted against their NDP coalition to not have a federal commission to address the pandemic response, is going to be very, very important to try to have the scope and the actual jurisdictional ramifications of any such inquiry become very, very clear to Canadians. So I would suggest that for the examples that I've given, meaning dental care and the proposed pharmacare bill, which we believe will come forward from this government with the guillotine that is hanging over the head of the Liberal Supply and Confidence Agreement with the NDPs, supposedly before the end of this year, then we need to be very, very clear on exactly what jurisdiction is going to be responsible for which parts of the inquiry, and which parts are federal, which parts, of course, are provincial jurisdiction. It is sad that, once again, legislation in this House is being ramrodded through Parliament by our Liberal colleagues, such that there was not sufficient time to have numerous stakeholders and experts called before this committee to understand the jurisdictional implications, which we had an absolutely excellent witness who we were not able to hear from during the last meeting. And as I said previously, we also know that there are significant stakeholders from the agricultural community who will have significant issues ongoing with things talking about alternate proteins and how farmers do their business. And when you look at farmers, Chair, you know, it always fascinates me that many groups want to take umbrage with the actions of farmers. Now, farmers rely on the earth to provide their livelihood, to feed the rest of us, to provide employment. And when you look at the difficulties associated with that, that people would suggest that farmers are not good stewards of the land is an utter insult. I would suggest that farmers, by nature of their work, needing the good fertile soil that will exist in order to grow crops in an efficient manner, that they would be the best stewards of the agricultural system, that they would have the best interests at heart of being able to grow food quickly, efficiently, with tremendous density, because not only do they benefit financially from that, but they also benefit, of course, from feeding the world, and that satisfaction that comes from understanding that, wow, we are actually able here in Canada to provide food for many of those who are hungry. Even though the fact that the carbon tax continues to punish farmers by making it more expensive to grow food, by making it, of course, more expensive to transport food, which again, the cost gets sent over to those consumers who, by nature of being a human being, have to buy the food. So again, when we look at the examples that we see here, Chair, we understand again that even though that most of this bill, in my mind, continues to be nonsensical, wide-reaching, unbelievably costly, et cetera, that it is important to understand which parts of this are provincial and which are federal jurisdiction. And that in order for those of us who live in agricultural-based communities, which there is significant agriculture in the Great Riding of Cumberland-Colchester, which I represent, or many of my colleagues, certainly from Western Canada, have significant amounts of agricultural land and farmers whose livelihoods need to be protected from the damaging intent, perhaps, of some of this bill as we get forward in looking at some of it. So again, we talked about this previously during a speech which I gave earlier today, which was actually very effective, understanding that we had unanimous consent after my intervention, such that people really understood the need to have very, very important words. And when we talk specifically about this amendment, then we need to protect provincial jurisdiction and limit the scope of this bill to areas of federal responsibility. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Are there any further interventions with respect to Amendment CPC 2? Seeing none, are we ready for the question?
We'll request a recorded vote, please, Chair.
Recorded vote on CPC 2, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Fisher. Mr. Hanley.
Sorry, was that me?
Mr. Hanley.
Yeah, Brendan Henley. Okay. Yes. No.
Mr. Jawari. Mr. Pulowski.
Against.
Ms. Sidhu.
No.
Mr. Ellis.
For.
Mr. Doherty.
We.
That was so an hour ago.
Mr. Generu.
For.
Mr. Majumdar. Monsieur Thériault.
Pour.
Mr. Davies.
Opposed.
He needs his camera to vote.
Mr. Davies, we need to see you in order for your vote to count. Can you turn your camera on? Thank you.
Mr. Davies.
No.
No. Okay. 5 yeas, 5 pour, 6 nays, 6 contre.
CPC 2 is therefore defeated. That brings us to CPC 3. Mr. Majumdar is going to move that.
I move to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn is not debatable. All those in favor of adjourning the meeting at this time, please raise your hand. All those opposed to adjournment, the motion is defeated. We are at CPC 3. Is there someone that wishes to move CPC 3? Dr. Ellis.
Thank you very much, Chair. You know, I think that what we need here is really related to advice and knowledge of experts. And one of the things that I believe has happened due to the divisive comments of the Prime Minister calling those, for instance, who didn't get immunized, racist and misogynists, that we need to get this country back on track with respect to science. And when we realize that this entire country, the world, in fact, has had the opportunity to move significantly forward, really related to advancements in science. And part of the difficulty is using semi-scientific words and political motivation in the place of science has hurt society significantly. And I would suggest then that continuing to add science, advice, and knowledge of experts, many of whom around the world were Canadian indeed in their ability to be able to look at the science of what was happening with the pandemic and give some reasonable advice. So I would suggest that that's important. I would also suggest, though, that we be incredibly careful in determining who those scientific experts are, in the sense that during the pandemic, there were many social media stars who came forward to begin to attempt to explain the pandemic to Canadians and indeed to all citizens of the world. I wasn't entirely convinced that all of them were truly experts. We would often hear that someone was I'll just make this up, a cardiologist who would then go on and talk about epidemiology. And I think that's an important thing. That doesn't mean that cardiologists are not important or they're not intelligent, but it means quite simply that they're not epidemiologists. And certainly asking those who do not have a significant expertise, even though they may have an ability to explain it, certainly doesn't mean that they are experts in the subject matter at hand. So I think that that continuing on with rebuilding the science in this, the faith in science in this country is going to be very, very important. And I would suggest that continuing to divide Canadians and call them racist and misogynists really doesn't add any ability to advance an argument. It's simply akin to shaming and blaming. And that really doesn't make any sense at all when we're trying to advance a significant scientific argument. So I would suggest to my colleagues, and I hope, even though when I made a short intervention, they clearly voted against that short intervention, that when I made a long intervention, they voted for it, that perhaps it might be necessary, even though they didn't like it, to explain and re-explain the nature thereof, that perhaps the length of the explanation is also important. But that being said, Chair, I think that suffice it to say that having scientific experts who are not simply social media stars would be essential in any inquiry coming up. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Mr. Doherty, please.
Mr. Chair, this is CPC 3. Right. I'll save my comments for the next one. Thanks.
Are there any further interventions with respect to CPC 3? Seeing none, are we ready for the question? All those in favor of the adoption of CPC 3, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. Where's Dr. Ellis?
He's voting in favor.
Okay.
From the back.
All those opposed to CPC 3, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Mr. Theriault, 7? Okay. Okay. The CPC 3 is therefore defeated. Suite, Monsieur Theriault, maintenant c'est le moment approprié.
Mr. Theriault, this would be the appropriate moment for the motion that you identified earlier. You have the floor. So I'm going to read it, that C293 at Clause 4, page 2, be modified by taking out to the lines 26 to 29. And the lines 26 to 29 are the following. In collaboration with the provinces and the municipalities, just to clarify, the amendment that was submitted to the committee is saying that Clause 3 is the subject of the amendment, but in your intervention, you mentioned the Clause 4. Can you confirm that we're dealing with Clause 3? No, it is Clause 4. No. I'm sorry, very sorry. It is clause 3 and paragraph 4. Okay, fine.
It's in order and I believe has been circulated, so the debate is on the amendment that Bill C-293, Clause 3, be amended by deleting lines 24 to 27 on page 2. Are there any interventions with respect to that amendment? Seeing none, are we ready for the question? Shall BQ amendment
Those amendments weren't distributed because we
Okay. So the amendment is before us, colleagues. Shall amendment BQ1 carry? All those in favor?
I'd like to request a recorded vote, please, Chair.
A recorded vote, Madam Clerk, please.
Mr. Fisher. Mr. Hanley. Mr. Juari.
Oppose.
Mr. Pulowski.
Against.
Ms. Sidhu.
Against?
Mr. Ellis.
For.
Mr. Generu.
In favor?
Mr. Doherty.
For.
Mr. Majumdar.
For.
Monsieur Thériault.
Pour.
Mr. Davies.
Opposed?
Yes. Yeas 6 pour 6, nays, sorry, my mistake. Yeas 5 pour 5, nays 6, contre 6.
The amendment is therefore defeated. That brings us to CPC. Oh, okay. Avez-vous un autre? Okay.
Did you have another? Mr. Thériault. Yes, another amendment that Bill 273 in Clause 4, page 2, be modified by deleting public health, line 25 on page 2. This motion is in order. The debate is now on the amendment. I just want to be sure. So this amendment that was adopted would be in collaboration with the provincial governments and municipalities to evaluate the intervention in the case of a pandemic. There's no and.
Dr. Ellis.
You'll be very happy to know, Chair, that I simply had a question, even though it's perhaps not the right time to ask it. But seeing the clock is 1:30, I do understand we're time limited on this bill of getting it back to the House. I guess I don't see any way that we're going to get through the rest of this bill at the current time. And I'm wondering if the Chair has a plan for going forward.
Wednesday. Any further interventions with respect to BQ2? Seeing none, are we ready for the question?
A request a recorded
Recorded
vote, please.
division has been requested on BQ2. Madam Clerk.
Mr. Fisher. Mr. Hanley,
No.
Mr. Jawari,
Oppose?
Mr. Pulowski,
Against?
Ms. Sidhu,
No.
Mr. Ellis,
In favor?
Mr. Generou,
In favor.
Mr. Doherty,
For.
Mr. Majumdar,
Strongly in favor.
Monsieur Thériault,
Pour.
Mr. Davies,
No.
5 yeas, 5 pour, 6 nays, 5 contre. 6 contre.
The amendment is therefore defeated. That, I believe, brings us to CPC 4. Is there someone that wishes to move CPC 4? Dr. Ellis.
Thank you, Chair. You know, and I think that that this is an amendment that everybody should feel like they should be capable of supporting. We know very clearly that three groups of folks: children, seniors, and essential workers, were impacted so impressively by COVID-19 that they should have special mention in any type of movement forward. Children, of course, we know that children were taken out of their routines, that they were taken out of their socialization events, such as musical theater or piano lessons or singing lessons or skating lessons. We know also, of course, they were taken, as skating is, out of their sporting events. There was no hockey, lacrosse, no gymnastics, and sadly, those specific areas for children are and continue to be, and always have been and always will be, a significant part of their maturation and of their socialization. And to understand very specifically, which I would reflect upon 2 years ago now, when we proposed a study on children's health. The study on children's health was supposed to be an entire study based on how COVID-19 affected children. Sadly, it became morphed into something significantly different from that. And the actual format that it took really was not conducive to being able to help Canadians understand the significant impact on children per se. And I've talked very briefly about their socialization in the sense of events and sporting events, etc. But that surely does not account for the non-specific socialization where, as your mother would say when you were young, is go outside and play. And we certainly did not see that happen, given to the fact that at one point during the pandemic, and I hate to remind people of this, but every single park and recreational space in the country was closed. Perhaps not at the same time, but certainly they were closed. And that ability for children and for adults just to get out and socialize disappeared totally. That, of course, doesn't take into consideration their educational sufferings that happened with the need and ability to move from in-person instruction to virtual instruction. And we know very clearly that there are children out there, because all of us in this place have heard from our constituents that some children continue to suffer the effects of a change in how their educational instruction was delivered. And when we begin to examine that, I think it important that we have experts who come and focus specifically on the instruction and educational opportunities afforded to children and how we may or may not do that differently in the future. I can't underscore enough how important education is for children and the socialization, of course, that exists with that. Moving on to seniors, I would suggest that very clearly there were many seniors who died because of the pandemic and because of the conditions in which they were living, which many people, I believe, knew about before the pandemic, but because of the nature of the illnesses that those seniors have, a blind eye perhaps was turned towards them and the situations in which they were living. But that, of course, must be balanced with that freedom of choice, Mr. Chair, in the sense that if one knows that you have a limited amount of time left on this earth, we all need to choose how we may spend that. And of course, we all know we have a limited amount of time on the earth. We just don't know how much it is, which of course can present some existential difficulties for folks. But that being said, when we know as we advance in age, we come closer and closer and closer to that, that the survival time, once we're in an alternate living situation, becomes less, the survival time becomes less, then it becomes part of our requirement and our freedoms as an individual to decide how might we spend it. And you know, if you, perhaps as an example, this may not apply to everyone, but if you knew you only had 3 years left to live, would you choose to spend it being not able to leave an institution, or would you choose to spend it with your families, with your family, even though you may get a deadly illness? I don't know the answer to that, Chair. I do think that perhaps it's an individual decision, but sadly it does impact society and how we restrict the freedoms of folks, including seniors, and what that means to them. We also know very clearly that many Canadians had funerals during the pandemic, and we know that funerals are also a time for Canadians to come together, to share that grief. You know, during my time before coming here, you would see families around a bedside who would share their grief, who would tell stories of that individual, often humorous ones, sometimes not so much, but there was always a requirement there in the grieving process so that they were able to come together and understand very clearly what this person meant to them in their life. And not being able to have those celebrations during the pandemic negatively affected families and individuals and how they interact. And I would be quite concerned that there would be ongoing negative impacts to families going forward from this lack of ability during COVID. And finally, Chair, I would focus on essential workers. You know, being a physician during that time, I guess I was an essential worker. Some people question your sanity when you leave a very well-respected profession and become a politician. But that being said, hopefully that you have a voice that you can bring forward. Essential workers, not just healthcare workers, and many healthcare workers have lost their jobs based on their status for the COVID-19 vaccine and having, for whatever reason, decided that they did not want or need the vaccine. And then, of course, that has presented them problems further on down the road with respect to their employability. We also know very clearly that other essential workers, truck drivers, for instance, those heroes were lauded throughout the early days of the pandemic, that they kept working and they crossed the border and they brought in essential goods. And then what we had was a prime minister who chose to ignore them and create division inside this country when they came to protest. And really, you know what, that all could have been very easily avoided if the prime minister simply would have met with those people in the convoy and heard what their concerns were. But no, Chair, what did he decide to do? He decided to call them names, and indeed, you know what? In the House of Commons, he called all Conservatives a name, which, given the sensitivities of the day and what has happened in the last 2 weeks, I will not even repeat that word. And to have a Prime Minister who called every Conservative in this House, and I don't know if the Bloc feels like they were included that, and maybe even the coalition with the NDP felt like the Prime Minister was calling them that particular name, when we know that that is a name that shouldn't be tossed around in any way, shape, or form as something that is simply a pejorative, but it has a very, very specific meaning given the events of what's happening in Israel and the Middle East at the current time. So it would draw people's attention back to the essential workers who, again, were lauded as heroes early on in the days of the pandemic, and then simply relegated to the trash heap later on, and name called and shamed and blamed for the propagation of the pandemic and for their freedom to choose what it is that they ever so wanted to do from a very personal basis. Now, when we look at those kinds of things, I think it also important that we outline and highlight very clearly that to continue to ask people about their vaccination status would be akin to me asking very personal questions of colleagues across the floor as well. I would never, for instance, ask any of my colleagues how the status of their chronic lung disease or their prostate cancer or their erectile dysfunction or anything like that really existed. I would suggest to you that that would be an inappropriate comment. But when people asked you for your vaccination status, that seemed to be an acceptable thing, which again is a very personal part of your own health information. Now, so if we don't get that right again, then there's going to continue to be problems associated with the ability to move freely and have freedom inside our country. So I would suggest that it's important that we take a very close look at those three groups: children, seniors, and essential workers, who are amongst the most vulnerable to another pandemic, and paying them a special focus for those who have borne the brunt of the pandemic, and especially as children will continue to bear the brunt of the pandemic for many years to come. I suggest that it would be very important to highlight those folks. And all of those three groups deserve special mention for those reasons that I have highlighted very clearly. So hopefully, Chair, that is something that is useful to the other members of the committee, and that we could have agreement that those three groups of folks would be paramount to a good inquiry and understanding how very specifically and negatively the pandemic affected those three groups of individuals. I thank you, Chair.
Mr. Doherty, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And for the benefit of our colleagues, I just want to read what we are suggesting with CPC 4. Is that on line 2, page 3, replacing the following. Begins, analyze the health, economic, and social factors relevant to the impact, with this amendment, to the impact of the pandemic in Canada, with special focus on children, seniors, and essential workers. Now, my colleague, Mr. Ellis, is succinctly, I think, for as the day has gone on, I think that was a pretty succinct explanation as to why it's important. But I thought I would take this opportunity just to remind our colleagues and those who are listening that the profound impact that the pandemic had on these three groups. You know, in Quebec, I believe there was an inquiry as to how seniors were handled, or how the impact on seniors. I remember family members and families reaching out to us during this, pleading with us to be able to do something for their loved ones that were all alone in home care homes, and essentially were their relationships were relegated to basically plexiglass or a window in between their loved ones, and how heartbreaking it was for the seniors basically to be all alone in their last final days. and this pandemic, and the loneliness, the sheer loneliness that was that swept our seniors and our home care homes, or our care homes, seniors care homes. My brother works for a care home, large care home facility, or facilities in British Columbia. He's a supervisor there, and he would relay stories to us about how his patients, like their health, absolutely plummeted during this time. And he said that there has to be a study, the correlation of this loneliness and this isolation on seniors. He said it was just profound. Not only that, but how the pandemic and how COVID swept through these care homes. You had essential workers, you had, for the first part of this, because there was such a shortage of nurses and staff that were going from one care home to the other, and they themselves were carriers of COVID and, in fact, impacting or infecting other facilities. Children, as it was mentioned by my colleague, I don't think we've yet seen the total impact that COVID had, and again, the impact of loneliness and isolation, not being with their peer groups, has had on the mental health and well-being of our children. I'll go back to my motion that on safe supply, where I mentioned that the overdose is a leading cause of death for children in my province, ages 10 to 18. I can't help but think that the pandemic has contributed to that, which I wish I was able to continue on, because that's what I was leading towards at that time. We know that 11 Canadians every day die by suicide. A further 275 will attempt suicide each and every day. And those are the stats that we know. We know that those numbers are actually higher coming out of the pandemic. We also know that domestic abuse and violence against, or domestic violence actually increased, lateral violence increased during this time because of the confinement of these families. Coming out of the pandemic, we know that over a quarter of our population are now forced to use food banks each and every month. And think about that for a second. The most recent statistics are almost 8 million Canadians are having to use food banks across our country. That's a quarter of our population. It's staggering. Speaking of violence, you know, I have a bill before the House, or it's in committee now, violence against first responders and healthcare workers. We saw an increase of that during the pandemic. Our essential workers, you know, our country was shut down, yet there was a very targeted group that had to go to work each and every day. Given all of the uncertainties that was circulating online and all the stoking of fears about the unknowns about this infection, this illness, and yet these people had to don their uniforms each and every day. Very often encounter absolutely horrific sights and sounds and smells, but also had to fear for their lives, whether they were just showing up to work, getting into the cars, being followed, It's unbelievable. The stressors, just that alone is unbelievable. As it was mentioned, this is, and I would hope it would come out of this study or this bill, is that the impact alone on our top leaders, on vilifying those that wanted their own choice. I mean, our Prime Minister said, should we even tolerate these people? It's crazy. We divided families. We divided communities. And I shouldn't say we. Families and communities were divided over this, vaccinated, unvaccinated. And, do you believe in it? Don't you believe in it? And the prevalence of forcing people to be isolated, alone, turning to social media, going back again to my motion. We know the prevalence of how easy it is for kids and teens or anybody that's looking for it to now get drugs online. It's staggering, and I hope that our colleagues will vote to include this in there. And I do want to mention one thing is when we're talking about our essential workers and all the bad stuff that came out of the pandemic, I think something like this would also focus on some of the good things that came out of the pandemic. We have in my community of Prince George, we have a drumming group, a First Nations drumming group, the UHNBC drumming group, and they would, every Monday night, through rain, snow, minus 40 temperatures, to this day, they still do it. From the very early on days of the pandemic, they would go outside of our hospital, and they would drum. They would drum and sing songs for the workers and the patients that were in the hospital, in the care homes. And what a moving vision or image, Mr. Chair, when you see these people that have been torn away or separated from their loved ones. They would come up to the window and they would put their hands on the window, or they would. It was so moving. And this drum group to this day, the University Hospital Northern British Columbia drumming group, led by my good friend Wes and Ivan, they do that to this day, and I think that's one of the amazing things that came out. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention them in this. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair.
With that, I think we should move to adjourn.
We have a motion for adjournment. It is not debatable. Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? All those in favor of adjournment, raise your hand. All those opposed? The meeting's adjourned.